This week, US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen is in China, where she faces the task of reviving an economic relationship that is more strained than it has been for decades. Her visit comes as Western leaders increasingly commit to reducing their trade dependence on Beijing, but stress that their intention is not to decouple.
That the United States does not seek a wholesale separation of our economies. We seek to diversify and not to decouple. A decoupling of the world's two largest economies would be destabilizing for the global economy, and it would be virtually impossible to undertake.
To discuss what all of this means in practice, I'm joined today by Alicia Garcia Herrero, Chief Economist for Asia Pacific at French investment bank Natixis and an expert on China. Alicia, I want to begin by asking you to describe to me the current state of relationships between the world's two biggest economies.
Well, it's a roller coaster, but the direction is clearly not upwards, no matter Janet Yellen's visit. I think Janet Yellen is coming to Beijing to clarify the new strategy, which is not decoupling, as it should be, because it is basically, as she rightly says, unfeasible. But she explains what de-risking means for the US, at least the most positive part, which is diversification. But I'm sure that at some point in the conversation, she will also add de-risking in the sense of reducing strategic dependence, i.e. national security. So these are the two aspects of de-risking that the US is pushing forward.
Now, one issue that has persistently weighed on US-Chinese ties is the imbalance in the two countries' trade relationship. Last year, the United States exported over $150 billion worth of goods to China, but imported well over $500 billion. That represents a huge deficit of $382 billion. Now, Alicia, before we dig deeper into that trade relationship, how do you distinguish, you mentioned a little bit earlier, but how do you distinguish in concrete terms decoupling from de-risking?
Well, I guess the figures you just mentioned, although they're huge and worrisome, are not the key for de-risking, because it could well be that the US is just importing low-end products that the US can replicate, and that deficit is just it's just good for consumers because they are consuming cheaper goods. But that's the past. That's not what we are in now, whether the US or Europe for that matter. Now we're importing high-end goods, some of which we cannot replicate. And that's where the risking comes to the forefront. And the most obvious example is indeed green energy, green manufacturing of solar panels, of wind turbines, and for that matter, also electric vehicle batteries. That's where the bulk of the problem lies, because China produces the most of it, certainly for solar panels, over 89% of our imports in Europe. And the same is true for the US. So that's the de-risking. The de-risking means I need to find other sources, not to become critically dependent on China and be subject, for that matter, to retaliation, which is what we've seen only recently with rare earth metals for the second time, after China did exactly the same thing to Japan in 2010.
And we'll be talking more about those export restrictions on the two metals a little later. But I want to talk to you about another recent development, because earlier this week, China introduced a new anti-espionage law, which gives authorities greater powers to access documents, data and items deemed relevant to national security. What does this mean for foreign businesses in the country? Well,
in this regard, we're moving from basically the risking, which is more imports, from China, or maybe even outbound investment screening and so on. But for anti-espionage, it's more China's territory, meaning our investment, already the bulk of our investment in China, already operating in China, will need to deal with these laws. And this is one of the very many. We have the national security law, we have data privacy law, which is also very intruding because cross-border data management is very difficult with China now. So all of that are basically hurdles for foreign investment operating in China already. And for those who are thinking of coming to China, of course, they have to put that into consideration as a cost, as a risk for them.
Yeah, and as we just mentioned, just days before Yellen touched down in Beijing, the Chinese government announced export curbs on 2 rare metals that are vital for making semiconductor chips and other materials. From August, Chinese businesses will need a license to sell both gallium and germanium to foreign buyers. Now, to give you an idea of the kind of products this could affect, these metals are used in mobile phones, solar panels, electric cars, and satellites. And as you can see here, China currently dominates the world's supply of both of those metals. Now, restrictions of this kind have been imposed on both sides, though. In October of last year, Washington imposed restrictions on US firms exporting microchips to China, with other countries such as the Netherlands making similar moves last month. Now, announcing the decision to restrict exports of gallium and germanium, China's foreign ministry maintained the move was not political.
China has always been committed to maintaining the security and stability of the global production and supply chain and has always implemented fair and non-discriminatory export control measures. It is a common practice for China to implement export control on relevant items in accordance with the law, and it does not target any specific country.
Alicia, what do you make of the timing of this announcement right before Yellen's visit?
Yes, right before Janet Yellen's visit, but also right after the deadline, basically, for the Netherlands to impose those controls on lithography machines started to operate. So basically, it is a very, very obvious timing. It has to be said, though, that licenses do not necessarily mean full controls. I mean, they can play with these licenses. They could, decide to impose controls on country A as opposed to country B. The licenses are indeed general. The point is who will suffer out of these licenses, who will not receive the license, in other words. And I think that gives China, of course, a lot of leverage. But learning from what happened in Japan, in 2010, what Japan did was basically to engage with one of its state-owned companies in investing massively in an Australian-based company, producer of gallium and germanium. And what they did is basically secure part of that supply chain, which led to China's actually reduction in the dominance of these 2 rare earth metals. So for me, what's going to happen is that once again, others are going to invest in these rare earth metals to the point that China might not have, at least for these 2 metals, the ability to retaliate.
OK, looking at the other side then, how big of an impact have those US export controls on semiconductors had on China?
Well, I would put it this way. I think it is delaying China's moving up the ladder in terms of the highest end semiconductors, so N+2, like very, very advanced and therefore small semiconductors. But delaying by how many years will China be delayed is really very hard to know, because it depends on whether China can actually bypass, to start with, whether it's buying companies or through third countries' imports. So it is not clear how effective it will be. I would say China is worried, which might mean it is effective to some point, but for how long? I think all of these things never work forever. There's always ways out to constraints, and China knows this very, very well.
If we look beyond US-Chinese ties now and focus on the situation here in Europe, where there's also been a lot of talk about the balance of power between the bloc and Beijing, let's have a listen to what German Chancellor Olaf Scholz recently had to say about the relationship.
No one is aiming for what was called decoupling at the outset. What we are talking about these days is de-risking, making sure that we don't end up in dangerous strategic dependencies, and that we tackle the continuing growth of China in a pragmatic way so these dependencies will no longer continue to exist.
Alicia, more talk about de-risking, not decoupling, but I think it's fair to say that the EU has struggled to address China with a single voice. Is this more down to a lack of internal unity, or is Beijing strategically exploiting the bloc's competing interests?
Well, it's quite clear that not every country in Europe profits in the same way from its economic relation with China. In some cases, even political relation. I would imagine that's where I would classify Hungary, for that matter. This is a very complex relation for the EU. So we have from economic winners until recently, Germany. I would say this is changing very rapidly, for the worse for Germany, and therefore because we see these economic winners winning less, to put it that way, I think we also see their policies kind of converging in a way to those of the European Commission, basically the central policies regarding China. But China, however, knows that it needs to keep that space, and therefore it uses obviously its strategic weight economically and beyond, as I mentioned with Hungary, to create that space. Why is this so important for China? Beyond our market, it's really because we are in the transatlantic alliance. So it is all about the US. The power of the US gets diminished if Europe is more aligned with China. And I think that's why China, indeed, to your question, uses the strategic space that we leave because of our, different agendas, which is rightly so, because we're different nations.
I want to ask you more about that transatlantic alliance, though. How does Washington view Europe's relationship with Beijing?
Increasingly worried. The U.S. is increasingly worried. I've never seen, congressional hearings on Europe-China relations as we have had only recently. I would say since Macron's visit in particular, because as opposed to Scholz's visit back in November and what has happened since, Beijing's visit and so on, I think Germany's position was better understood and therefore clear to Washington. But I think Macron's visit was a surprise to Washington. And I think now the question is, where are we with our alliance? And also given the fact that the US has continued to support Ukraine, even after the midterm election. So I think for the US, this is a big question. Are we there? Are we there for the US? Or are we not there for the US?
Finally, Alicia, if there is one issue that is affecting the entire planet, it is climate change. How will the current tensions between China, the US and the EU, for that matter, affect efforts to prevent an environmental catastrophe?
Well, there's two channels. First is the most obvious. China is the largest emitter in the world. We can discuss whether this is per capita or not per capita, but the world doesn't understand per capita concepts yet, because this is about emissions, full stop. And I think China's weak economic situation, on the one hand, should help because China should emit less. But on the other hand, we know that is pushing China to continue to use coal for production, and that China has actually lifted its yearly targets for emissions, keeping only the 5-year plan targets and the 2030-2060 net zero targets. So peaking at net zero, sorry. So basically, we know that it's actually not helping. China's weak economy is not helping decarbonization. And the second one is related to China's strategic dominance of green energy manufacturing, as I mentioned before. Why? Because the rest of the world is worrisome about this, is worried about that dependence, and it can end in two ways. Either we create a complementary supply chain, which reduces our dependence on China. And I think the US and Europe will need to work on this together, because otherwise the number of subsidies will be huge, or it delays our own decarbonization because of the risk of excessive dependence. So I think this is why we are at a very, very difficult, in a very difficult situation, in my view, as regards decarbonization, de-risking. These two concepts should be put together in a way or another, and China at the center of both.
And we will have to leave it there. Alicia Garcia Herrero, thank you so much for being with us. It has been a really fascinating discussion. And thank you all for watching. Do join us again for another business special soon. Until then, from me and the team, it's goodbye and take care.